And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. Thanks for joining us again. I'm your host, as always, Hank Garner. Today, I'm thrilled to have one of my best friends in the writing space, Josh Hayes. We've known each other for a long time. We don't get to hang out as much as we used to, but we're going to try to fix that soon. Josh, military sci-fi is kind of his wheelhouse at the moment, but I have a feeling that Josh is going to tell us how he has designs to stretch those boundaries one day. Welcome to the show, Josh.
It's true. Hey, thanks so much, man. I was telling you before, I absolutely love chatting with you, and it's been way too long since we've had an opportunity to sit down and shoot the writing stuff, as it were. So, thank you very
Right.
much for inviting me back on.
Absolutely. Josh, there's a fun question that I've been asking a lot of people as we start shows lately, and I just have a feeling that you've got a good answer for it. What is a piece of writing advice that someone has given you that has stuck with you? Now, it could have stuck with you because this is sage advice that is just amazing, and you're so happy someone shared it with you, or maybe it's so terrible that you can't help but look back on it, and that's the same exact facial expression that everybody has because everybody's gotten horrible advice from somebody. So, good or bad or both doesn't matter.
Um, Man, that's a super good question and not a softball to start the interview. So, on good on you, good on you. Man, terrible writing advice is so easy to come across. Like
Yes.
the bad writing advice seems to overwhelm the good, and there's so many people out there peddling the next best thing, or if you do this, you'll be a successful writer. It's just so many of that stuff. It really just makes me want to bang my face in my keyboard. And good writing advice, though, is really hard to come across, and it's more than not more often than not, it's extremely subjective to who you're talking to. And one of the things I've noticed from doing, I mean, we're in season 7 of Keystroke right now.
Nice.
So just about 7 years of doing that show, one of the things I noticed is every piece of advice is from every author is different.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say for me personally, the best piece of advice that I could get from anyone that I've stuck with me is to read a wider spectrum of fiction than you write. And that seems very simplistic, but like I write mill sci-fi, and for the longest time, all I read was mill sci-fi.
Right.
And so you get, a just a steady stream of identical concepts and identical themes, and it's good if you're just starting out and you're trying to understand the tropes or the stereotypes that you do and don't want to hit.
Right.
But as you get farther on, a lot of that stuff becomes more intuitive than not.
Yeah.
And if you're not reading outside of your genre, you're missing a lot of things that you can bring into your writing that would make it stand out or make it better. The biggest example of that I can think of off the top of my head is I recently I read the books last year in 2021. The series called the Gray Man series, which actually just came out on Netflix as a movie.
Yeah.
And the movie, as it always happens, is nothing like the books.
Right.
But the books, as a study in craft, are phenomenal books, and the
Yeah.
writing is spectacular. And the way that he writes, Mark Graney is the author, the way that he writes narrative action, phenomenal, superb. And I have taken a lot of how he writes that and incorporated that into how I write action narrative. And had I not, those are modern day thrillers.
Yeah.
And so had I not gone into that genre or found those books, a lot of that stuff I would not have found. And so that, I guess that's a long-winded answer of me saying read outside your genre, because there are a lot of things that you will pick up through style and through just different storytelling methods that will and can improve you as a writer.
That's fantastic advice. Have you read Mark Graney's new book, Armored?
So actually, I've got the signed hardback.
Nice.
Sorry for going out of frame. And I've also got the signed hardback of his latest Sierra 6. I'm a huge Graney fan. I have not, so this is interesting. I have not read this one because I listened to the audio drama before this came out.
Yeah.
And it's basically the exact same story. This is obviously just expanded in novel format. The audio drama was outstanding.
Yeah.
And I've only listened to a couple of those. Like there was one that they did for Aliens a couple of years ago that was basically like the sequel to the second Aliens movie, and they just did away with Alien 3, which was great. Yeah, as they should. Well, it's interesting because everybody hates Alien 3, but that was my favorite one besides the second one, just because I liked David Fincher's directing. But yeah, we could go round and round of that. Way better than Alien Resurrection, that's for sure.
We had Mark Graney on the show last week, and
oh, cool,
talking about Armored, and my son Ian is waving as he comes by to pick up my other son. Anyway, he phenomenal writer, and the audio drama. I'm glad you mentioned that because audio dramas don't always work. You know, you look at some, and who's the company I'm blanking right now that does mostly audio dramas? Their tagline is like a movie in your head.
I don't know. I don't know that I've heard of it.
Graphic audio. Is that what I'm thinking?
Oh, maybe.
Yeah, they do a lot of fantasy book, and you look at there's a cast of like 30 actors, and you're like, this is going to be amazing, and not always. Sometimes a book just needs to be read the way the author wrote it. There's a narrative style that's why novels are different than screenplays or stage plays, but yeah, that was a phenomenal interpretation for sure.
I read so the audio drama, the Armored audio drama is really good, and one of the things that I found as an author reading, and a lot of times like it's like you're watching a movie or you're watching a TV series, and as a writer, you're picking out the things that they're doing, and more often than not, it's the things that they're doing wrong, and you're like, oh, that's so dumb. But in this book, there's a lot of like the antithesis of show don't tell, and in the audio drama, they have to do exactly the opposite because you can't show what's happening, you have to tell. So, for instance, there's a scene, I found it very jarring at first, but as I got about a quarter of the way into the book, I realized what was happening and why it was happening, and it made sense, is that everything that happens in the audio drama happens through dialogue. There is no narrative, right? And so it's just like watching a movie, except you can't see it.
Right.
And so there's gunshots and there's explosions and there's car sounds and all this other stuff. And, there would be a scene where the main character has to go from the back passenger to the driver's seat. And he says in dialogue, hold on, let me get behind the wheel. I'll climb into the seat, get down, and then I'll drive. And there's stuff like that happens through the book that you're like, okay, I get what you're doing. You're setting the scene for the listener and you're doing it through dialogue. And had it been a movie, you wouldn't have needed that line, but because you're listening to it, you needed it. And so I can see why a lot of people would be turned off by that, but it made sense. Oh, my camera's coming out. There we go. It made sense in the thing.
Yeah.
And I really, after I got used to it, I really enjoyed it.
You mentioned earlier that you're in season 7 of Keystroke Medium. For the folks listening who don't know what keystroke medium is, give people the elevator pitch for your show that you do.
The elevator, elevator pitch is very simple. If my camera will, why is the camera not focusing? It's going to bug the crap out of me. And I'm sorry for waving
It's
my
all
hand
good.
in front of the camera like a crazy. The elevator pitch for Keystroke is basically a couple of guys hanging out in a bar, drinking beer, talking about writing. And it's evolved obviously over time. We started with one show, and then at one time we had like 5 shows.
Yeah.
And I think now we're back down to 2, sometimes 3. It kind of depends. We're kind of like on a hiatus year this year. There's just a lot of stuff going on. Kayleen and Lauren have a lot of work editing now, and Scott got a new position at his job. And so we're still kind of working around trying to figure out what's best for the company and what's best for that. But it's a writer centric podcast. We talk about story. We talk about, writing, different aspects. Last week we had Neil Asher on talking about his writing life and his, just everything that he's doing. He was, of course, he had 2 short stories in Love, Death, and Robots, the Netflix anthology. And that's just, it's, if you're a writer and you're looking for a couple of guys that really have absolutely no idea what they're doing, but you want, like, they're your people, you can come.
Yeah.
Like, I always tell people we did it extremely backwards. And this, we've talked about it before. Like, for instance, Larry Correa, he has a podcast now. Well, he didn't have a podcast before he was famous. He got famous and then started a podcast. Right. We did it exactly the opposite, and nobody knew who we were. We were like, "Hey, come hang out with us." And it's still, but nobody still doesn't know who we are. But it's fun to still hang out and talk.
Well, I got into podcasting, and I've told this story a million times because I wanted to be a writer, and I was already a writer, but I wanted to be a better writer than I was. And because I had a history in radio, and I kind of knew, how to do the thing. And the best way that I could figure out to be better at what I do is to hang out with other people that were good. And then just hopefully by osmosis and by building relationships with these people, you become better because you hang out with better people. It's kind of like your mom always told you, if you'd hang out with a better class of friends, you wouldn't get in so much trouble,
Right.
So did you have those kinds of ideas when you started podcasting? Like, where were you in your writing life when you started Keystroke Medium?
I barely had begun. What's interesting with the start of Keystroke Medium is it's not only did we do it backwards, but it was almost an accident. I had wanted to do a podcast for the longest time. I just didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how I was going to present it. And Scott and I, Scott Moon, who lives here in town, and we both had the same job. And
I thought you were going to say lives here with me. And I was
in
the basement.
He's over there. He lives within spitting distance right behind me now, and some apartments, and he's building a house that's a mile away from me over there. And once his house gets built, it's gonna be, that guy that like taps on windows like outside the bedroom and like, hey, that's gonna be me. But so we
used to tell stories.
Yeah, can Scott come out and play? So we used to meet weekly and drink coffee and just talk about writing. And then one day I had all 4 of my kids and I couldn't get out of the house, and my wife was working, and I was like, why don't we just like have a Skype call or a whatever it was at the time? I don't remember. And so we did, and we ended up talking for a while, and we did that several weeks in a row. And then the idea of the podcast came back to me, and I was like, I still want to do this podcast deal. And I said, well, we're talking about writing anyway. Why don't we just record our conversation? And so I pitched it to him, and I was like, look, we don't have to do anything special. And we didn't, which is also the wrong thing to do. I was like, let's just record our conversations and we'll throw them up on the internet, and we'll see where it goes. And that's what we did. And the idea of doing it live was really just because I didn't want to edit it afterward. I wanted to just be done with it and hit record and then leave it. And that's just how we've been doing it ever since.
Did your writing and publishing life coincide with the launch of Keystroke? Like, when did you publish that first? I think it was a novella. Was that the first thing that you published?
It was, and it's not available anymore. But it was a
Which
novella
breaks
called
my heart because I love that book.
Yeah, it's well, so the first
The Second Star series is what we're talking about.
Yeah, Second Star is the first big project that I wrote and published myself. Um, uh, I started that back in like 2011, 2012 ish, and basically it was a science fiction reimagining of Peter Pan.
Yeah.
And fun story, great story. And actually, when Arcane came out earlier this year and I watched it, I was like, this is exactly what I wanted Second Star to look like. And these people stole it from me, but whatever. It was a fun story. I published that, and right around the same time I published that is when we started doing the podcast. Well, what happened with the podcast is everybody asks me all the time, and I don't know if you get the same question too, is do you make money off your podcast? How much money do you make on your podcast? Everybody thinks Joe Rogan millionaire when you think of podcaster. And I'm like, well, I don't make any money off the podcast. But what I did make was a lot of opportunities.
Yes.
And I met Richard Fox. I met Nick Cole and Jason Onspach. I met Steve Bollier, a whole bunch of people that now are really close friends that I have manipulated is not the right word, coerced maybe into giving me money for book projects, and that has made me a lot of money. And my writing career would not be what it is today without Keystroke Medium. 100%. There's no argument there. I would be maybe a quarter of the writer today without Keystroke.
Yeah, I 100%. The relationship return is more than any monetary compensation could.
Right.
You just can't even put them in the same ballpark.
Yeah.
Because we are kind of our overarching theme today is finding your niche and where you fit in the publishing world. That first series, the Second Star series that we talked about, is different from the stuff that you're writing and publishing today. There was a different feel, a different subgenre, if you will. There were a lot of similarities. Like I could tell where you were going as a writer, but next to what you're publishing now, they're a little different. What talk a little bit about finding the sweet spot of what you enjoy versus what makes money, because that is a concept that a lot of writers wrestle with, and finding the thing that you can be successful at, however you define that, is very difficult for a lot of people.
Well, it's interesting because, you could look at becoming a writer. Becoming a writer is not like just picking a career. You look at whatever the wide spectrum of opportunity that's available in the world career wise, and you're like, which one makes the most money? I'm going to go do that. But you can't do that because maybe you don't have the skills to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. There's the opportunity to go and do a thing, but whether or not you can do it physically, mentally, that kind of thing, those all play a part. And I think the same thing happens in writing too, not to that extent, because I think if you really wanted to, you could probably write anything as long as you intuitively are a good writer. But there are certain genre, like I would be a horrible romance author. I could not go and do that, even though that's where 90% of the money is made. Like everybody that makes millions of dollars in the indie community, there's a lot of them that are romance authors.
That's what your wife said.
Yeah. But I grew up reading science fiction. I grew up reading David Weber and Peter F. Hamilton and all those guys. And
can I interrupt you for just a second? You've gotten to be pretty good friends with David Weber over the years, haven't you?
Yeah. We exchanged messages. Yeah, he called me out of the blue a couple of months ago. Yeah, it's great.
By the way, just as a kid growing up reading science fiction, starting this, podcast, allowed you to meet one of your heroes. That is, you know,
100%. And he blurbed my book. He blurbed Edge of Valor. He read it, gave me phenomenal feedback on it, and now his blurb is on the cover of my book. And like
crazy.
I could never have seen that
Right.
coming. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and he's been on the show several times. He loves coming on the show, and those are some of the longest shows we have on record. Because if you've ever talked to David, he's not a short speaker. He can
He's got
speak.
things to say.
Yes. Yeah. So I came to writing science fiction very naturally, and I wrote the first thing I wrote after Second Star never finished. I actually outlined the last book, and I know how the story ends. But right around that time is when I hooked up with Richard Fox, who was in the middle of writing the Ember War. I think he had finished book 6 or 7 or something like that, and I had him on the show. I think he was like the 5th guest on Keystroke, and he messaged Scott and I and was like, "Hey, I'm looking to do some other projects in the Emberverse. If you guys could pick something," and he gave us kind of a list of, scenarios, "would you want to write one?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm there. I am there." And so Second Star got put on the back burner, and wrote Terra Nova. Was exceptionally well received by his audience and by fans all the way around. We had a phenomenal launch. It's still one of the most well received series I've ever written. And of course, wrote Stryker's War with Nick and Jason in the Galaxy's Edge universe. That book is the single most successful book I've ever written. Wow. Because it was a one-off book, but I've made the most money off of that book than I have all the other ones. And then I wrote the Valor series, and the Valor Edge of Valor was a book that I planned for 6 years, and it went through a number of iterations before I wrote it. It was my first solo release, and that was received really well. And the things that I learned writing Terra Nova and Stryker's War and even Second Star all went into Edge of Valor, and I kind of found my voice in that book. And that's, people know me for my mill sci-fi. I write really straightforward, not really introspective action adventure mill sci-fi. And I'm intuitively, I know that I'm good at that. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. That's where I have to keep. I retired from the police department in 2019 to write full time, and I'm being I'm moderately successful. And so I've got to keep pounding away at those. I'm working on a series right now called Weaponized, and that's basically going. It's like a combination of the Gray Man or Terminal List with John Wick, but it's in space, and it's so it's going to be fun.
Speaking of Richard Fox, I maintain a small, limited Facebook presence to see pictures that my kids post and to post memes that frustrate Richard Fox. That's my sole purpose for being on Facebook is
100%.
If I get a comment from Richard Fox that he is extremely frustrated and he's cursing me, then I have done my job for that day.
Yes. I think anytime that you can just set him down the road of just frustrated anger, it's great.
Right.
It's great.
Oh man. How has indie publishing changed over the 7 years of you doing Keystroke Medium? We've seen all kinds of trends come and go. Right now we're seeing an interesting time where publishers like Athon, our very good friend Steve Bowyer, and Rhett Bruno are taking things that they've learned from indie publishing and then banding a bunch of authors together and resources, and then publishing alongside the big guys while maintaining an indie attitude.
Yeah.
So we're seeing several companies doing that now and just doing it phenomenally well. And then you've got guys like Richard Fox, who's a heavy hitter in the indie space, but also is I think he's doing a book with Bain now.
Yep.
I think.
He's doing a couple with them.
Yeah, yeah, and you got Nick and Jason that you mentioned with Galaxy's Edge, and the whole cottage industry that's built up around that whole project. Um, how do you see the landscape these days? And again, looking back, from the indie gold rush as it was when we first started to
Yeah.
now, it's you leave you a little swimmy headed.
It's very interesting. I think there's a couple of things that are happening in storytelling as a whole. I made a note so I can touch on it after I answer your question, because I think it's
Okay.
an interesting comment. But indie is interesting. Like you said, back when it first started, in the golden age, a lot of people made a lot of money, and you don't see
Right.
those people anywhere anymore. Nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whether or not that's because they just made all their money and dipped, or the readers figured out that they weren't very good authors and they
Right.
just slid away back to obscurity or whatever. It's
Probably a
interesting.
mixture of both.
Yeah, it's interesting because fundamentally things have shifted, especially on Amazon, where you used to be able to do a free book and that would skyrocket your book up
Right.
the charts, and then you would slap it back to $2.99 and make a crap ton of money because it was still rising the charts. And they
Right.
changed that, and then 99 cents became the new free, and now people aren't doing that anymore. But if they are doing it, it's for a specific reason, and there's a whole bunch of things happening. And I think one of the interesting things that I have started seeing is the shift back from quantity to quality. And that's something that I have tried very hard to be a proponent of, is the quality. And for a while there, for the longest time, 2, 3, 4 years, just dozens and dozens and dozens of books coming out that were, in my opinion, half-assed books and not written well, and we're just taking advantage of the market. And okay,
Right.
rightfully so. Okay, fine, you made money, but I think now that ebooks as a thing is really becoming mainstream more. It's becoming more of a thing where everyone is doing it. Especially in, after the pandemic, when stores closed and you couldn't go buy, the hardcover books and people were reading the ebooks. I think the type of reader is shifting to want to read quality because they don't have time to spend wasting their time reading junk.
Yeah.
And that's not said as a disparage to authors that people don't like their books. I'm just saying in general, people are making, I think, the shift to well-written quality books that treat their audience as intelligent people rather than dummies. And that is a huge shift to me. And I think writers that are taking advantage of that are going to do very well in the long term, because you give books more rereadability, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Ben Stevens said audiobooks too.
Oh yeah, true.
Audiobooks are a huge growth market, around the biggest growth market in publishing right now.
I agree.
Audiobooks are nothing new though. You can go books on tape go back to the 80s probably.
Yep.
I don't know exactly, but they've been around a long time. Why do you think this sudden boom, and when I say sudden, the last 5 years or so have just been a steady growth trajectory? Why do you think that is? What's going on that?
Well, I think there's three main reasons for that. And I've been listening to audiobooks for years. I remember
Same.
I think one of my first audio, well, that's not true. as a kid, I used to listen to these books on tape, or they weren't even books on tape. They were audio dramas on tape called The Adventures in Odyssey. And it was a Christian type program, and you had some life lessons or whatever, but it was an audio drama. And they
You
came
mean
in
with
these.
Chris and Wit?
Yes. Oh, those were great stories.
I have every cassette of
Oh,
Adventures in Odyssey from when I worked in radio. We played them every afternoon, and I got the collection of. I raised my kids on Adventures in Odyssey.
oh, so they're so great. I think my parents still have them, and I used, that we listened to them on car rides, and I listened to
Oh
them
yeah,
going to bed, and so I've been no stranger to audio at all my whole life.
yeah,
And I listened to the Harry Potter series on CD, driving in the car or whatever. And so I absolutely love reading through audio, and I've been doing it for years. And what I think the three main catalysts are for this, like you said, boom,
yeah.
is one, the quality has really, really gone through the roof in terms of, you know, uh, not hearing this when people are reading, or breathing, like the small things that really make your audio experience better.
You mean
Those
those
things.
first two Dresden Files books?
Oh man, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, those are
Those
tough.
things are real, and the quality of narration, where they're shifting the tone of the voice, they're adjusting for character voices, and it's not quite a drama per se, but
Yeah,
they understand how you're listening, and so they're going to give some character voices to enhance the experience, as it were. I think the quality is probably number one. The availability, I think, is really a significant factor, because you can download Audible on your
yeah,
phone, and I can find a book, I can download it in 30 seconds, and I'm listening to it. I don't have
right.
to go to the store, I don't have to go to the library, I don't need to carry around a Walkman with a headphone and all that stuff. It's just right there.
Yeah,
And the second thing is, the readers, or listeners in this case, we talk about attention spans, and how
mhm,
people cannot sit and just read, which I think, and I can't do that either. And you can just turn it on and do the dishes, or do the laundry, or you're driving your car, and you don't have to stop doing what you're doing in order to enjoy a story. You can just, if I've got to do, like, when I mow the lawn, I've got big, like, Workman noise canceling headphones that
right.
I play my audiobook with. It takes me an hour to mow the lawn, and so that's an hour I get to listen to my book. And so I think those three things are really, really important, and they're really what I think is driving that explosion. And I think the stigma of listening to books is really going the other way. I hate the argument where these book reader snobs are the you listen to the book. You didn't read it. And I'm
Right,
like, get out of here. I know the story. I could repeat to you what the characters say. I didn't read
right.
it. And I saw a comment. It was a Twitter interaction. I don't remember who, but they posted the picture on Facebook. This was just in the last couple of days. And the comment was, talking about I can't believe that people still listen to books or whatever. And I'm like, are you going to talk shit on a blind person who has to use Braille to read the book?
Right, right.
I mean, it's just, they're listening to it, or they're using their fingers. I'm like, you used your fingers to read the book. Come on. Like, I don't have time for those people. Like, yes, I enjoyed the story listening to it, so go screw yourself.
What was it? Neil Gaiman that made the
Yeah,
Braille
that's what.
comment? I think I saw that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that idiot.
Right, right, exactly.
I don't
100%.
even have. I don't even. I can't even expound on that.
Yeah.
That's dumb. Um, as an author who has your works translated to audiobook, do you ever think about that in the writing? Does it ever occur to you, like maybe half of the people that read this book are going to listen to it?
Yeah.
Does it ever factor in for you?
It does in limited ways. For instance, in dialogue, I am a very big proponent of said and asked. Those are typically the only dialogue tags that I use if I'm using that kind of a tag. But I'll also use tags where, something stupid. He said something and then he took a drink, right?
Yeah.
An action beat instead of the dialogue tag. Because if you're listening to it and every single person says something and then it's he said, she said, he said, she said, he said, she said, that becomes extremely distracting, even though normally you probably wouldn't hear the he said. But if it's every line, that becomes extremely distracting. So when I write
Right.
dialogue, I really look for ways that I can cut he said out or she said, whatever it is, or write the dialogue in a way that it flows narratively, so you can maybe use it. If they're in a room, he can lean against a wall or he can, pick his nose or whatever it is, and you don't have to have those just extremely repetitive dialogue tags. But I mean, for instance, I wrote a character in the second Terra Nova book that he was a German scientist, and I wrote out his dialogue phonetically, like, "Oh, we will explain." And Richard got it in my first draft, and he was like, "Absolutely not! Take all that shit out. Just write the dialogue normal." And I was like, "Yeah, but his accent." He's like, "Write it normal." And I'm like, "Okay, fine." So I wrote it normal. Well, then Luke Daniels read it the way that I phonetically wrote it, and I was like, "Yes, score." But some of that stuff you can't plan for. But when it happens, it really makes the writing, it takes on its own thing.
That's hilarious. You are kind of known in the writing circles as the outlining guy, or you have been
It's true.
adamant through the years about your outlining process.
That's true.
One of the features in Dabble that we really love is the plot grid and um, the tools that we include that help you to imagine your story, to build that roadmap that you write with. Um, have you always been a solid outliner? And if not, when did you start seeing the importance of kind of understanding the story before jumping in?
So, yes and no. When I wrote Second Star, I had a very small outline. And
Yeah.
honestly, when I wrote Second Star, when I started the project, I was trying to do what Hugh Howey and Michael Bunker had done with Wool and Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
And what they had done is they wrote 25 to 30,000 novellas and then published the omnibus after.
Right.
And at the time,
And got readers hooked along the way.
and got readers hooked along the way,
Yeah.
and they blew up. I mean,
I remember
absolutely
those
blew
days.
up. Yeah. I
We
mean,
had a front row seat for that.
right. I mean, talking about the way things change and that
Yeah.
they are completely different. So when I started that project, I was like, okay, I had an idea for every part, and I just started writing every part. And part one was like 24,000 and a half words. Nailed it. Part two was 45,000 words, and then part three was 65,000 words. And I'm like, this is not working out exactly the way I planned it. And
It grows in the telling.
yeah. And so by the time I got done with the third book, I'm like, okay, I think that if I can write book 4 at 100,000 words, I should finish the story. So maybe someday I'll be able to do it. But after that, Terra Nova, I had to Richard outlined that book. Well, we outlined it together, but we outlined the story idea, and then he wrote the expanded outline, and that was about 14,000 words, the outline for the first book. And as we kind of got more accustomed to the process and knew what we were doing, that outline became shorter. But I still write pretty significant outlines. And one of the things that I like to say that's an argument to pantsers or gardeners or whatever you want to
Mhm.
call them, is, it takes away from the experience and you lose some of the creativity that you do. Well,
Right.
that's true, but I pants the outline.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't outline the outline, I pantsed it. And
I've never
um
really bought that argument. That seems
yeah,
like a weak argument to me.
it is. And there, I know a writer who will write 230,000 words and then cut 70,000 words out. And I'm
That's
like,
insane.
that seems like a really big waste of time.
Yeah,
If
you have more free time than I do.
Yeah. And so I write really significant outlines that go into detail with chapter and go into detail with what I want to do with the character. A lot of times those will change though, and I'll have to adjust different things that I'm doing. I'll have to shift it specifically in the weaponized outline that I'm working on right now, or that I'm working off of right now. There are things in a chapter that I had to highlight and move to a different chapter, because in the narrative, as I'm writing the chapter, I'm like, that doesn't exactly fit here. I'm going to have to move it somewhere else. And so my outlines are beginning to end. I know exactly what's going to happen. I know where the turn points are going to happen. I know how it's going to end, and I know all of the stuff in between, but they're also very fluid. And so I'm not, I learned that very quickly. A lot of people like, if I get the outline, then I'm stuck. No, yes, but also no. You can go back and you can change things. So I still do outline pretty significantly.
Um, a couple of years ago, I don't remember when exactly, but you and I did a podcast, and you made an offhand comment that has stuck with me and has
Uh-oh.
changed the way I think about things. You said everyone outlines. Some people do it before they write. Some people take the pile of stuff that they've written and then they outline and put it all together. And
Right.
and honestly, that changed the way I think about story structure and about the your involvement in arranging the story. That
Right.
everybody does it. It's just, are you going to do it ahead of time or are you going to do it after the fact? And I think the consensus is to do as much of it ahead of time as you can, especially if you're uh, a writer with a production schedule. That
Well,
seems
and
to work better.
100%. And one of the big reasons I outline is I know uh approximately how many words my novels need to be. And I aim for at least 100,000 words, and I like to be between 100 and 120,000 words for a novel. I also know that I like to average 2,000 words a chapter. So if I can outline, 50 chapters, I know that I'm going to be close to that 150,000 mark, or 100,000 mark. And if I do 52, 53 chapters, I know I'm going to be slightly over, slightly under. I also know that some of my chapters are 700 words, but some chapters are like 3,000 words. So like, if I can look at the story and say, I'm at 47 chapters, I can like, okay, do I need a pad? Do I need to do I have space to fit in a subplot somewhere? I can look at that structure like you're mentioning and say, okay, I know what else I can do with that book. Or do I need to, for instance, in the last Tranquility book I wrote, there was a POV that I completely cut out, because in the writing process where I had planned, 60 chapters, I got to the point where I was like, I really don't need all of this other stuff. I can tell the things that I'm telling in those chapters, I can use or put in other POV chapters and not need all this other stuff. And I cut like 20,000 words out because I didn't need them.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Um,
I was reading this comment you put in.
yeah. Chris Wilson said, I tried that before with a series, no outline, just a general idea. Didn't work. I think a basic outline, at least, is pretty much a necessity to get it done without going crazy. Yeah, especially if you're going to write more than one book, it definitely helps to know where you're going.
Well, and I'll use Edge of Valor as an example. Edge of Valor, it was an extremely complex book that I would not have been able to write just by the seat of my pants. I had,
Yeah.
because that book deals with multiple firsthand accounts of a single incident, but those accounts are wrong and the characters are lying. So I had to know the truth. I had to know what actually happened, but then I had to know how they would describe the lie, why would they do these different things. I had to put all that together for 5 POVs. And then I had to cross connect all of the POVs to make sure that I wasn't repeating incidents, because I didn't want to be repetitive in the story, but I also didn't want to give anything away from any of the other POVs. And I would not want to, I mean, that outline changed, I think, 6 times before I finally set on this is what's happening. And but I think, basic outlining, Steve Bowyer and I talk about writing a lot, and we both kind of had the same outlook on writing. You have a basic, say you have a 1-sentence line per chapter. This is what's going to happen in that chapter. Then I go back and I write 3 or 4 paragraphs of where it's at, what are they doing, what are they going to talk about, are they going to do something, is there a fight? And then I go back in after that, add more action, add some dialogue, and then I go back after that, flush the dialogue out, expand it, cut out. And so it's an outline, but it's also the beginning of like a massive snowflake method of writing the novel. Right. And I can sit down and write an outline in 2 or 3 days. Sometimes I've done it in a day. I just outlined a fantasy novel a couple of months ago that would have, if I wrote the whole thing, it'd probably be around 160, 170,000 words. I did that in a day and a half. And it was literally just chapter blank, this is what happens. Chapter blank, this is what happens. And you're telling yourself the story, and then you can go back in and show it after the fact.
Great point. You have made a place for yourself in science fiction and military sci-fi specifically.
Yeah.
I know that that's not all that you're passionate about. You and I and Steve Bowyer, we all love fantasy stories.
Yeah.
I love. I grew up on Tolkien and Terry Brooks and all of that. I'm not very good at writing fantasy. And I know that you have a desire to write fantasy story, and we're such big fantasy nerds that we started a short-lived podcast.
Oh, the shortest-lived podcast in the history of podcasts
about a fantasy series that will go unnamed, and it wound up just me, you, and Steve talking about how much we hated this freaking series and couldn't believe we had to go 13 books deep in this, and we just gave up.
Fortunately, they called us feminists and racists and all the other things, and we were like, okay, cool, we don't have to finish the book now.
We're literally just talking about the book.
Right.
Yeah. Do you still want to write fantasy?
Absolutely.
Is that something that you hope to do one day?
I love mill sci-fi. I love writing sci-fi. I love what you can do with sci-fi.
Yeah.
But my passion is in fantasy. One of my favorite authors is Brandon Sanderson. Larry Correia. I have not read the Monster Hunter Files, or the whatever it is called, from Larry Correia. I think I started it. I'm like 1 or 2 chapters into the first one, but I absolutely love his Saga of the Forgotten Warrior series. Right. Absolutely love it. I got to talk to him in Las Vegas last year at 20 Books, and I was hanging out at the Bain booth with Tony and David and Larry, and I said, Larry, I got to ask you. I've got a theory about what you're doing in the story. Can I ask you about it? You don't have to tell me if I'm right, but can I ask you about it?
Yeah.
And I told him, and he was like, you're super close. The only person that has got it 100% correct was Jim Butcher. And okay. I said, all right, okay. I love those books. Brandon Sanderson is by far my favorite author of all time in fantasy. I love The Song of Ice and Fire. Anything fantasy. I started reading Rob J. Hayes, The Heresy Within, I think. Joe Abercrombie does Grimdark. My fantasy is fantastic. I love fantasy, and I'm 100%. The thing that attracts me to fantasy is the use of language and prose that is not poetic, but almost poetic
Yeah.
in the way that you can present your story. And the longer that I am an author, I used to not like dialogue. I used to not like kind of an introspective conversation or even just an introspective moment. And that's why I write action packed books predominantly. But the more that I write, the more that I really just want to write two characters sitting across from each other having a conversation and having that tension build the story. Like if you've, I'm sure you've read A Song of Ice and Fire.
Oh yeah.
There is action in those books, but a lot of that tension comes from interpersonal interactions and conversations that you're like, I know that that person's lying. The other person doesn't know that that person's lying. And the other
Right.
person's going to stab that guy in the back.
Right.
I like that kind of tension and I like that kind of narrative drive. And that's what I want to do. I've planned a trilogy and I've planned a standalone novel in the universe. Um, I've written a couple of short stories in the universe. I absolutely love this world that I've created, and I'm working on it here and there. Like I said, I've got to write the stuff that puts the food on the table first. But hopefully someday soon, maybe next year, I will be able to dive into those books. And everybody that's read them so far has absolutely loved what I've done with prose and character. And so hopefully I'll be able to have one of those on the bookshelf soon.
You said earlier that where you really thrive in military sci-fi, especially, is um, characters that get down to business and
Mm,
not so much internal conflict.
right,
A lot of fantasy is internal conflict.
right.
There's usually a big journey, a physical journey, but there's a lot of emotional, metaphorical journey that's
Yeah.
also happening. That's really kind of a contrast between the two. How do you see your writing style, like that you said is paying the bills,
Yeah.
um, versus the writing style that is almost needed to operate in fantasy? How do you see, taking readers that you've established over here and bringing them over to this other style? Do you have a plan?
Well, yeah, the plan is I hope they do, but I know for a fact that a lot of them will not bridge. And that's okay for me.
Yeah.
I hopefully am writing this for a different market. Um, um, but it's the thing about my writing in mill sci-fi is that my writing is extremely tight in that, I don't go into a lot of family dynamics, or there's not really any love stories, or
Yeah.
there's friendships. I dive into camaraderie, the esprit de corps that you get in a military setting. Like those are the things that the readers of those books want. Learning about interpersonal relationship with parents or siblings or whatever. Those things aren't a part of the books that I write, but I think those are interesting things to explore. And I think in the genre of epic fantasy, that is what people expect in those type of books. And that's something that I want to get more into. I want to talk about, I want to explore relationships um, that are more than just standing next to your brother on a firing line shooting at the enemy. I want to explore, miscommunications. I want to explore the things that as humans we deal with on a daily basis, um, and look at how that can change characters' responses and characters' interactions with people on a deeper level, not a boring level, but on a
Yeah.
deeper level than you typically get in a mill sci-fi novel. And I've set up some things in this book. I mean, that the overarching theme of these books is basically what happens to a world or a civilization where people believe one thing because that's always been the thing that they've believed, and that their belief is kind of self reinforcing. When that belief is wrong, what happens? Like when it's actually wrong, not that like subjectively you're believing the wrong thing, but if it's wrong, how does that affect the world? How does that affect, everything in it? Because, people are dumb, that. I mean, we're stupid, and we will latch onto something and go, this is the truth, 100%. I believe it. And it might not be.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's subjective, but a lot of times it's objective. And there are still people that are like, now the sky's black. No, you're wrong. No,
Right.
the earth is flat, or whatever it is,
So you're not a flat earther?
No. No, what really drives me nuts about I've seen a meme where they're making fun of flat earthers, and it's a picture of the solar system, and every single planet is round except for Earth, that is a square plane. And I'm like, come on, guys, come on.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Josh, this hour went extremely fast. What are you working on right now?
First of all, it did. Holy crap. Like, I feel like we just started talking.
I know.
I am working on, so I just finished up Tranquility 3. It's with Athon's editors right now. I have absolutely no idea when I'm going to get that back. And I'm working on Weaponized Fury, which is the first book in the Weaponized series. I should have talked about this earlier. I outlined this book beginning to end. 3 weeks ago, I realized the book was not working, and that I was I was promising something in the first book that I was not going to fulfill in the second and third book, because what I wanted to tell is the story that I wanted to tell is kind of a Black Ops CIA type ish, ground branch ish story. Of course, it's far future. I'm just using that as reference.
Yeah.
But I was not delivering that in the first book. And I was, the first book I'd planned out to be this gladiatorial Iron Man type fight to the death. And there's going to be a whole bunch of, dead aliens and all that stuff in this captured slave ship or whatever. And then in the second book, they were going to go off and do all this Black Ops stuff. And I'm like, that's not what I'm doing in the first book. If people read the first book and like it, they're going to get to the second book and go, this is two completely different things. This is not what I signed up for. And so I spent about 3 days completely reworking my outline and cut about 40,000 words. And now I'm not starting over, but it's pretty damn close.
Are you going back and fixing book one?
So book one, before I figured out that I was doing it wrong, I was at about 75,000 words out of about 110. So I had about 40,000 words left to write in the original outline. And what I did, I'll talk about it. You're my friend. So I had planned it was like Gladiator meets Iron Man in space was the theme of this book. And so this special forces guy gets captured, gets put into slavery, gets sold to this arena, fights in some games, gets some notoriety, kills everybody, gets free. And then in the second book, they go off and they do all these Black Ops stuff. And what I realized in about the 70,000 word mark is that I'm having all these fights, but we already know that he's a really good fighter. Like, we already know he's a badass. Like, we've seen this already. I've done it, 3 or 4 sections of showing the reader that this guy can fight and he can lead people and he's a really good person. Having 3 or 4 more fights isn't going to do that. Like, we don't need that. And to get to where I wanted to be in book 2, how do I get that? I'm going to have a time jump somewhere between books or whatever. And so what I decided was I can cut out all these other fights. I had them fighting like these dragons, which were like a callback to like lions and bears in the arena in the Coliseum back in, but then I realized I really didn't need it because I've already established that he's a really good fighter. So what I went back and did is I decided to shrink the portion that he's a slave as a gladiator, I'm condensing all that into about 45,000 words and cutting out all the rest of it, and then adding in another plot line to take it back to the full length again. And that's what I'm working on now. I think I'm at about 60,000 words again. And so I hopefully will have the first draft done probably middle of August. And we're going to be, I got to finish 2 and 3 before we release them. We're going to do the rapid release thing.
Yeah.
Speaking of indie traditions,
Yeah.
we're going to do the rapid release thing. So once I get those books done, they'll be out.
I have to ask you this: when you have a story that's not working and you've got 30,000 words that you've written, that you don't need to use, that are, and you need to cut those out. Do those words ever get reused somewhere, or do you just use that as, this was me over familiarizing myself with the world, and that information will wind up in the story somehow, but maybe it's just in my background knowledge of the world or something that I pull from? Or do you ever recycle those words and say, you know what, this would work really well over in this story, and that, are those lost words, or do you consider them a benefit of in some way?
In this specific case, they're just gone. There's not there. I don't foresee any circumstance that I could reuse them or tweak them in a certain way, just because of how specific they are to this one book.
Right.
For me, as an author, I'm always trying to improve. So every time I write, I am trying to improve my craft, and every time I write, I'm working on that. So the 40,000 words I wrote, they're good words, but they're just not needed. And I think that goes back to the quantity over quality. I am 100% sure that there are writers out there that will get all the way through a story, realize they didn't need these 40,000 words, but they're like, screw it. I wrote the words. I like them. I'm going to leave them in the book because I like them. And they don't do anything for your story, and they might end up hurting your story. And it's okay to delete words. Like, I think we get on this deal where we're so precious about our words and our time spent on a project that, if I'm losing whatever I'm losing $1,000 because of the time spent on this. Sometimes you just got to hit delete, man. Sometimes you just got to hit delete and start over, or go on a different direction. That's what I mean. Like, I outlined, but sometimes that outline ends up not working, and you've got to do something different, and you've got to be okay with deleting words. I mean, I've written enough where I'm not beholden to my words. I'm not that precious. I'm like, that sucks. Delete.
Right. Well, and I think some people have the erroneous idea that because you outline that is set in stone, that is a foundation that's been laid, that never can be adjusted. But sometimes, as you have just described, you get in the middle of the writing and you realize that no amount of planning ahead of time could have foreseen where this was going to end up, and you just 100%. Have to go back and re-architect things.
100%. And that's the thing. I think that outlining so you understand where you're going, like even just from section to section, where you're like, I am here, I know I have to be here, let's write that. But if you get there and then the next section is maybe it'd be better if we go over here, then just adjust on the fly and go over there. And sometimes I know for a fact that I've got 14,000 words of outline that I'm just like, you're gone, bye. And you just don't get that back. And it's all, I don't know what they say, the 10,000 hours before you become a professional. I don't really ascribe to that. I think that's a super long time. I don't know how many years that is, but it's a long time.
Yeah.
If you're talking about a full-time job, that's what, 5 years of full-time job before you and 5 years doesn't sound like a long time, but it's a pretty long time, especially in our industry. And there's people that write, 10 novels a year. So,
right.
exactly. I'm not scared of deleting at all.
Yeah. I like the concept of the more work you put in, the more of an expert you become.
Sure.
Like, I get that, but yeah, I've always thought the 10,000 hours was a little arbitrary. And
Well, look how many people write their first book and it just goes bing, like Andy Weir, you know, in The
exactly.
Martian. It's an outlier, right? You can't use this as an example. And I'm sure that he wrote other stuff before that, but
Yeah.
do you think he wrote for 10,000 hours while he was in NASA, whatever he is, before he
Yeah.
wrote The Martian? You know what I mean?
It was an outlier, and a pretty great outlier at that.
I'll give you that. I'll
Yeah.
give you that.
So, Josh, what if people are just discovering you today and never gotten into Josh Hayes writing before, where would you point them?
I've got a website. I am horrible about updating it. I was just thinking the other day, man, I should just do away with the website. I don't do anything with it. JoshHayesWriter.com is my website. I have a Substack that I've made 2 posts on, and I don't even know what the URL is. Mostly I'm on Facebook. I have a Twitter account, but I very rarely dive into the cesspool. And I'm on Instagram as well. I think if you just Google or Facebook Josh Hayes, I'm one of the only ones that comes up, or Josh Hayes author. If you Google Josh Hayes, make sure that you put in the author, because if you don't put in the author, then you get this like really dumb Dirk by, I'm not saying, I'm just kidding. He's a motocross guy, rides motorcycles, and apparently he thinks he's famouser than me. More famouser than me, because he's the only one that comes up when you Google just Josh Hayes, period. Which I think is just that he's monopolizing on the name. And look, I'm cool too. I think I should be on the front page of Google just as Josh Hayes, but whatever.
I agree. Or go to Amazon and search for Josh Hayes.
You could do that too. Yeah,
that's
I'm the only one on there.
There you go. There you go. Keep the motocross guys off of Amazon.
Yeah.
Josh, thank you so much for joining me. And if people want to catch Keystroke Medium live, when do you guys do that?
Right now we're doing Mondays at 2 p.m. Central is our live time. If you go to keystroke.medium.com, that website is kept up. You can find a list of all our links to all of our shows. I think we have like 600 shows on YouTube, a whole bunch of authors, dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews with authors. We have our own coffee now. You can buy coffee if you need coffee, or Facebook. Our Facebook group is super active, and YouTube is youtube.com/keystroke medium.
Excellent. We'll send everyone over to see you. Josh, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me back on, man. I'll have to do this sooner than later.
Absolutely.